So, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us here tonight on this cool, wintry evening. It's fantastic to see so many of you here with us for the conversation tonight about the Vantage Point essay After America by Emma Shortis from the Australia Institute. Just before we get started, my name is Noah Schultz-Bayard. I'm a director at the Institute, and I wanted to acknowledge that we're meeting this evening on the lands of the Kaurna people. This spot that many of us are fortunate enough to call home between the rolling hills and the ocean, it's a privilege to be here, but we also must acknowledge that this was home to other people for tens of thousands of years before any of us came here, and this land was not ceded, and we are on the stolen land of the Kaurna people and pay our respects to elders past and present. Like I say, it's a thrill for the Australia Institute to be able to put on this event. I'm so heartened to see so many of you here with us tonight. I'm hoping that we can keep the energy up for an hour-long conversation about what is some pretty tough subjects at a pretty concerning time for the world. Before we are able to introduce our fantastic panelists onto the stage, I just wanted to play for you a short video of some of the work that the Australia Institute has undertaken over the previous year. I want to take this opportunity to thank you for being with us, because by being here, you're a supporter of the Australia Institute and our work. We are thrilled that there are enough people here in Adelaide to pack out this pub on a cold night to talk about the important research that Emma and my other colleagues do in this space. So without further ado, a short video, and then we'll introduce our panelists onto the stage.
Thank you. I think it's really important to have a think tank, a group, looking at the overarching principles. One of the things that makes it special is that it encompasses all the issues confronting Australia.
The Australia Institute, it's revealed that 2/3 of people in this country believe corruption is common.
The Australia Institute shows 90% support for rules around truth in political advertising.
Well, more than half of the gas exported from Australia is royalty-free, according to research from think tank the Australia Institute.
The Australia Institute.
The Australia Institute.
The Australia Institute.
If we collect more tax and lower the price of energy, lower the price of medicine, lower the price of childcare, lower the price of going to the doctor, you know what we'll do? We'll lower inflation.
The question isn't whether Australia has the capacity to lead with integrity. The question is whether the people in this building have the courage to do it.
Poverty is a policy choice. These are things that can be addressed. We know how to do them.
I and others would argue that actually more often than not, Australia's relationship with the United States makes us less safe.
This great submarine deal is almost certainly going to result in us having no submarines. It's a terrible, terrible mistake.
Government has to change its view.
Destruction of native forests.
Australia is one of the biggest consumers of fashion per capita in the world.
Climate integrity.
The Whistleblower Protection Authority.
Record profits and price gouging.
90% of Australians are saying, we think this is a good idea. Our parliament could do its job.
To have institutions like the Australia Institute doing original research that underpins the arguments of those who want to reconstitute the dream of democracy, that is the greatest gift to anyone who wants to keep the idea of democracy alive.
Thank you. So those are just some of the highlights of the last year of work from the Australia Institute, and we're excited for the year ahead because so many people at the Australia Institute are economists. We obviously think in financial years. So happy new year to everybody, happy new financial year. And we couldn't do what we do without your support. So if you are able to support the Institute with a donation at any stage, it's always appreciated, but also coming to our events and supporting us in person like this is already so appreciated. So thank you for coming along tonight. I'd like to now welcome our speakers up onto the stage for our conversation tonight. Senator Sarah Hanson-Young and Dr. Emma Shortis. Please give them a round of applause. So, Senator Sarah Hanson-Young, representing the Greens and a Senator for South Australia since 2008. Sarah has proudly represented this state, giving a voice to those who are too often forgotten in Parliament. Sarah acts as the Green spokesperson for environment and water, arts, media and communication, tourism, transport and gambling. But as a global citizen, Sarah is dedicated to keeping Australia engaged with the rest of the world through the exchange of ideas and collective global action. Named a World Economic Forum Young Global Leader in 2016, she remains committed to advocating for the rights of vulnerable people in Australia and globally. Please, a round of applause for Senator Hanson-Young. We're also joined tonight by Dr. Emma Shortis. Emma is Director of the International and Security Affairs Program at the Australia Institute. She's a historian and writer specialising in the history of politics in the United States and its global influence. Emma's latest Vantage Point essay, After America, Australia and the New World Order, which we'll be discussing tonight, is out now. It draws on her extensive research on the Australia-US relationship and her time spent in the US, and it sets to make a crucial, fundamental point, which is that the America we thought we knew is gone, and it isn't coming back. It also explains the current landscape and how Australia can chart its own path to prosperity and security. As I said, copies of the Vantage Point essay, After America, are available at the back of the room, supported by Matilda's Bookshop. Thank you so much for coming along today and making it possible for you to pick up your own copy. Emma will be available for signings after the event, and the book will be available for purchase after the event. So please don't forget that. And just quickly, I wanted to explain, Vantage Point is a new essay series from the Australia Institute. We've recently launched our own publishing house, Australia Institute Press. Vantage Point is one of the first series to come out of that, and this is the first essay in that series. They're released seasonally, so there'll be 4 a year. You can buy a copy here, or you can subscribe and have all 4 copies arrive in your mailbox at home as they're published. The next version of Vantage Point will be our Executive Director, Richard Dennis, with an essay entitled Dead Centre. So, enough housekeeping. I think we should move on to the reason that we're all here, and that is to talk through the situation that's facing us and the re-election of Donald Trump. Emma, can I start with you? And can you talk us through how we got to this point? I feel like it's easy to get caught up in the day-to-day. There's new news every day. I'm working on a new mental health and sleep hygiene routine where I wake up every morning, roll out of bed and check Twitter immediately to see what terrible things have happened in the world. I highly recommend it. But there's a lot of history that's brought us to this point. Could you please reflect on how we've come here in our relationship with America?
Sure. I mean, I think there's a lot to be said about how the United States got to this point. That might take a long conversation, but I think when it comes to Australia in particular and our government's response to Donald Trump, I think we have to go back to the long history of our relationship with the United States, which is driven by a foundational insecurity. So a sense that Australia needs a great protector, be it Britain or then the United States, in order to keep us safe. It's a foundational issue for a colony founded on dispossession and genocide to seek out a great white protector. And I think that goes a long way to explaining the history of our relationship with the United States, that we need this protection. But we've never had a guarantee of that protection. We've never been sure of that protection. There's a myth, I think, surrounding the relationship that the ANZUS Treaty, which is our security treaty with the United States, guarantees us protection from the United States, that they'll come and save us if we ever need it. But that doesn't offer us anything of the sort. It offers as my colleague Alan Bean puts it, the promise of a chat if something goes wrong. And that's not really enough to guarantee your security. And so Australian governments have historically been driven to try and shore up this security guarantee, to try and give the United States enough that they will promise to protect us if we ever need them. And that's why Australian governments have enthusiastically supported American wars, no matter where they're fought and no matter why, often pledging support and troops and treasure before we're even asked by the United States. And that, I think, goes a long way to explaining, that insecurity goes such a long way to explaining why it is that even when Donald Trump is in the White House, even when it's this guy running that place, we have a way of understanding the alliance that, frames thinking about the United States and Donald Trump as, what can we give him? What can we do to make him care about us, to make him promise to still stand by us? Should we give him all of our critical minerals? Will that be enough, do you think? And I think, that really long history is a way of understanding our approach to Trump, but also understanding the Orcus submarine deal, which I think is a symptom rather than a cause of the relationship. So that's a long way of saying that insecurity is, I think, what explains our relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And we will delve deeper into the Orcus situation and its implications for Australia and South Australia specifically a little later on in the chat. But Sarah, I wanted to ask you, the second Trump term has already been different from the first, but what do you see as the implications that his second term is having on Australian policy locally, but also for our international relationships?
Well, it's definitely been different, and I would say the mask, if there even was one in the first term, has well and truly been taken off.
The orange plastic mask.
Yes. Yeah. And I think it's fair to say that both Trump's ambitions are very strongly on display, but so are those that he has surrounded himself with. And unlike last time, where a lot of the people that were working in the administration and surrounding Donald Trump were people that were putting a bit of a brake on him and trying their hardest to kind of regulate and moderate. And now it feels that there's a whole posse around Trump, notwithstanding some fallouts. I heard the news today that Donald Trump's thinking he might deport Elon. Okay, but not here, okay? So I'm all for having an open immigration and checking people's visas, but there's some people I say no to, and I say no to Elon. But Elon's a good example, actually, of the type of people that Trump has surrounded himself with in this term. They too are nakedly ambitious for their own interests, and in fact are egging him to go further and further and further on things. So there's no one there really acting as a brake. And the interesting thing about the fallout with Elon and Trump, although it does feel like some kind of, boys, brawl in the street, is that over the big beautiful bill, piece of legislation, the tax cuts and all the things that, big spend bill that Donald wanted, that even Elon thought that maybe that wasn't the right thing. But I think it's more self-interest from him. He didn't want the competition. It was going to be helping his competitors and his business opponents. So that's what he was arcing up about. Anyway, so I think there's definitely a difference. I also think naively, others around the world, including here in Australia, went into the beginning of this term thinking, oh, he's not going to do all these things. He didn't go as far as we thought last time. It won't possibly happen. And then we had on full display, day after day after day, these executive orders being signed. I mean, right down to, from withdrawing from UN agreements down to removing the ban on plastic straws. Like the whole gamut. It just, incredible. But really, I think the shift started to happen in that meeting, and I'm sure you all agree with this, Zelensky and the Ukrainian president. I think that on full display, the arrogance, the bullish behaviour, the deliberate, unveiled kind of embarrassment and humiliation, and the fun and the enjoyment that both J.D. Vance and Donald Trump were taking out of this kind of humiliation. That's what I think really it shocked a lot of people. And of course, for us in Australia, we've been this all happened in the middle of an election campaign, and up until this point, the Conservative side, the Liberal Party, of course led by none other than Peter Dutton, were trying hard to kind of legitimise Trump and to say they could be his bestest friend. They'd be better friends than Albanese would be. Leave it to Peter. Peter Dutton will be his bestest friend, and it'll all be fine. And then all of a sudden, we saw how this administration and Trump would treat their friends, and Australians were shocked. And then, of course, the tariffs happened. So I think Australia was naive in going into this term, thinking that he wouldn't possibly be as bad as he had said. And I think what we've had to come to grasp with is Donald Trump wants attention. He wants reaction. He wants outrage. He wants people to be outraged at him so that he can be outraged back. And if you just ignore him, as many of us did in the first term, he doesn't feel satisfied and he'll keep pushing. So I think we're having to learn to recalibrate.
It's as you refer to in the book, Emma, the distraction grenades that he throws. It's very hard not to chase each one and get distracted every day by something new, but there are such large forces and such large changes happening that I think it's quite essential not to be distracted by the smaller but very entertaining and quite wild daily news. On that note, some of the big things. We have to talk about the elephant in the room, the nuclear-powered but not nuclear-armed elephant, Orcus and the submarines. The Albanese government refers to its plan for the implementation of Orcus as the optimal pathway, but you make the point in the book that it is neither optimal nor a pathway. It's sort of failing on all fronts, but you say it's riddled with risk, but that the greatest risk is if, against all the odds, it somehow miraculously comes to fruition in the way that it's talked about. Can you explain to us a little bit the risks in implementation, but also the risks in execution?
Sure, thanks, Noah. It's worth emphasising that there's risks all the way down. There's risks in success, there's risks in failure. I think in terms of the deal itself, the way that it was put to me by one defence expert who was describing the optimal pathway, which is the plan to acquire these submarines, is that every link in the chain is weak. It's just a matter of which one breaks first. And our government, I think, is not yet willing to face up to that reality. So I think, we saw Malcolm Turnbull say in that video earlier that this is a terrible deal that is likely to fail. He has allies, unlikely allies, in people like another former Prime Minister, Paul Keating. This is the kind of alliance that is building because this deal is so terrible for Australia. But I think you're right, Noah, to point out that there are significant risks if this deal, against all the odds, this is a heroic assumption, but if we assume that the deal does succeed, there are huge risks for Australian sovereignty and for the future of our ability to make independent decisions about our own security. Australia is already geared towards, as I was saying earlier, to supporting American militarism and American wars, no matter what, no matter why, no matter who's in charge. But what Orcus does is take the next logical step. I think, in that process. Part of the deal involves, for example, Australians crewing US-flagged Virginia-class submarines, so being on American submarines. And what that means is that if the Trump administration or whatever comes next decides to take the United States into war, for whatever reason a conflict begins, not only would a future Australian government have to say no to involvement in that war, which is already historically unusual for Australia, they would have to actively delay American deployment to that conflict. So they'd have to call up an American president and say, we don't want to be involved in this, and that means you stopping those US-flagged Virginia-class submarines so that we can extract our crew. Do we really think that a US president is going to countenance that? Or that, given our current circumstances, an Australian government might be brave enough to do that? So what a successful Orcus deal means, even a partially implemented deal means, is that Australian involvement in US-led conflicts becomes the default setting. And the extraordinary thing about that is we haven't even had a conversation about whether that's what we want.
Thank you. And speaking of Orcus, it holds special significance to us here in South Australia. In Adelaide tonight, the role that Orcus will play just down the road in that direction means that it has significant implications for South Australia specifically. Sarah, could you talk us through what you see as the potential impacts for our country, but also our state here?
Yes, well, firstly, just in relation to what Emma was saying, that we haven't had this conversation about putting nuclear submarines aside for a moment, just that being so deeply wedded to the US defence strategy, and how on earth Australia could even possibly think we could unpick that, on the cusp of a US president saying, okay, they're going to war. And you're right, we haven't had that conversation. Australians are, though, starting to have a conversation about what all of this means. And I think politicians are really slow to catch up with it. And some of my colleagues would say, well, you can't even possibly be talking about this. This is putting Australia's security at risk. This is being un-Australian. This is, you're putting our relationship with our biggest protector at risk. Don't even ask these questions. We'll get, we'll get to that. We'll get to that conversation. Well, Australians are having it. It's not that we're going to. We are in the midst of it. And politicians are really, really slow to cotton on. So, and one of the things we haven't discussed when it comes to these nuclear submarines and South Australia's role is what that means for us. I mean, there hasn't even been consultation and communication properly with the local community where these radioactive things are going to be hosted. What does the community feel about that? What's the impact on having this type of material literally in our backyard? What does that mean for making our community a target? Because, of course, if this is all about being a defence, some people see that as a risk and a target. So we haven't even had that conversation with our local South Australian community. But there's also this other element, and I think this is the other elephant in the room in this conversation, is that, I've been in politics 17 years, and I feel like every single federal election there is a conversation about a commitment to South Australia building new submarines. Like every election without fail. It's almost like clockwork. It's like 18 months, 12 months out from the election, there's some agreement between the state premier of whatever flavour, whatever colour, versus the feds about what South Australia... This time it really will come. We will get the jobs. This will happen. This will be the silver bullet to manufacturing revival in our state. And it just hasn't happened. And now we know that it's even further away, because actually what we're talking about is the Orcus is front-ended with all of these other things which require Australia paying money to make sure the US can get the materials and the weapons they need and the machines they need, that our crew will be on American Virginia-class submarines, as Emma said. Like, it's all front-loaded with Australia doing everything for the US, and we might get to our bit in 2 or 3 decades' time. So again, South Australia, I believe, is being kind of led along without much to stand for. I don't think it's a good deal for us. I think if you think about the amount of money, $380 billion plus, can you imagine the jobs that we could be creating in advanced manufacturing for a slither of that money right here in South Australia? What we could do for investing in the care economy jobs right here in South Australia. What we could do for tourism in this state for a tiny minutia of that amount of money. I mean, it beggars belief. And any time the government turns around and says, oh, we can't afford this, we can't afford free childcare, we can't afford to wipe student debt, we can't afford to make sure we raise the rate for unemployed people who are still living below the poverty line, I think, well, hang on a minute, why can't we afford it? Oh, because we're giving the United States of America tens of billions, hundreds of billions of dollars for something that's not going to actually make us safer.
I think there was a very telling moment when Orcus was first announced, and Josh Frydenberg, who was Treasurer at the time, was asked in the press gallery at Parliament House, but it's so expensive. How are we going to afford it? Hundreds of billions of dollars. And he said, well, if something's a priority, then it's affordable. And they'll find the money as long as they prioritise it. And the fact that we have a climate crisis that's out of control in this country and an inequality crisis masquerading as a cost of living crisis, and they're not being addressed, actually reveals priorities in government. And the fact that it's ongoing is a significant concern. Just a quick comment on the format for this evening. So we're having panel conversation for a little bit longer, but then we will invite questions from the audience. I'll give you warning for when we're moving into that section, but not too far away now, so please start thinking of questions you would like to hear the answers to from our panel. But before we go there, Emma, polling from the Australia Institute has shown that Australians view Trump as a greater threat to security than Xi Jinping or Vladimir Putin, even before the recent strikes on Iran. In your view, how do these developments impact our safety and security?
I think they have a huge impact, Noah. I think Sarah is absolutely right to point out that, the Orcus submarine deal won't make us safer. And I would extend that to say that our alliance with the United States, as it stands at the moment, it does not make us safer. In fact, it puts us more at risk. And exactly as Sarah was saying, the Australian people have recognised that. They now see Trump as a greater threat to world peace than the leaders of the world's 2 most powerful authoritarian states, one of which is currently engaged in an illegal invasion. That's an extraordinary shift in the way that we see the United States, and it's in response to reality, reality which our leaders haven't caught up with. Trump is, and I argue this in the essay, an active and direct threat to the security of Australians and the security of the world. We can see that, I think, in the way he is catastrophically undermining the institutions, imperfect institutions, of course, but the institutions of international law, engaging in quite clearly illegal strikes against Iran, in doing things like withdrawing the United States from international organisations. And I think it's Trump is so, in some ways he's so useful because he highlights truths, that we have been unwilling to face. And one of those is that the way that we think about security is really lacking. Trump is a threat to international security because he thinks he can bomb his way to peace. But he's also a threat to our economic security. He's a threat to health security. There was a study in the Lancet, in the medical journal just this week, which estimates that the Trump administration's dismantling of USAID, the US Foreign Aid Agency, will conservatively result in the deaths of 14 million people by 2030. 14 million people. Like, if that is not a direct threat to the security of the world, then what is? You know, how can we not think of Trump as a threat to security and the security of our region in particular? And again, I think, you know, the Australian people have caught on to that reality. They know that Donald Trump is, you know, not only not a friend to the United States' traditional allies, but a direct threat to their security. And the fact that we still have a Deputy Prime Minister, you know, who's going on the national broadcaster and talking about Australia's shared values with the United States and specifically identifying those shared values as democracy and the rule of law, just doesn't gel with the reality of what's happening. You know, we live in a fundamentally changed world where the two things that, you know, we have relied on for our security, which is the United States and the international rule of law, are about as unreliable as they've been for several decades. And even recognising that reality, you know, is a huge step for the government to take, but it's going to need to take it pretty quickly, I think.
Just quickly, a quick follow-up on that one. In your work, you spend a lot of time thinking about security and national security, and you touched on it in your answer, but I was wondering, could you explain just briefly on the narrowness of the interpretation of the concept of security and your thinking around expanding the aperture of the conversation in the Australian security establishment?
Which is very established, isn't it? Look, I mean, I think that's, again, what one of the things that Trump exposes is the really kind of poverty-stricken and ungenerous way that Australian governments have thought about security and thought about security for Australians, which is really, to put it, I think, quite crudely, is just the temporary absence of inevitable war. You know, Australia is always under threat. Conflict is inevitable. The threat of invasion is inevitable, and there's nothing we can do to mitigate that or build peace. We just have to, you know, court the United States in order to ensure that, you know, we don't come under attack. That's a really ungenerous and narrow way of thinking about our security and what actually makes us safer, when I would argue, and a lot of people would argue, that national security is, the wellspring of national security is strong domestic policy, and it understands security as not just the absence of war, but the genuine thriving and safety of people when it comes to health, when it comes to access to opportunity, when it comes to economic equality, when it comes to climate action and being able to live in a safe environment. And again, I think Trump, you know, really highlights how just understanding security in hard terms, in terms of the absence of war, is not enough. And it's not enough to ensure, I think, critically, long-term security and long-term stability.
Thank you. You wanted to add to that, Sarah?
I do. I think the world has changed because of Donald Trump. And I don't think anyone in this room would argue that it's more safe than it was. It's definitely less. That Trump isn't doing everything he can to make himself wealthy while he's as the president. It's all about self-interest for him. He's running the show to make himself as wealthy as possible. Those around him are doing the same. But it is just absolutely naive for Australian politicians and governments and those in the established security sector to think that how the world was 3 years ago is what the world is now. It just is not. And it takes, it takes a long time to turn the kind of ship and the cogs of bureaucracy, and I think that's what we're seeing, because Trump's whole agenda and his attitude and the way he does things is he acts fast, he acts erratic. What he says one day is different to what he said the next day. In fact, it's your fault that you thought he said that yesterday when he's actually saying this. So he is playing a totally different game. And the Australian bureaucracy and security community, I really think are struggling to work out how to go. But the world has changed. And I think Richard Marles, for example, Deputy Prime Minister, when you listen to him, as Emma's already outlined, he's still talking about these shared values. And it doesn't fit. It doesn't make any sense. And Australians are increasingly seeing that, because we can see this on our phones, on our televisions, day in, day out, because Trump is so media hungry, right? He is an attention seeker. He is a media megalomaniac. And because of that, it's all out there, right? In one way, one of the things that Trump has done is he's created an atmosphere where you can say the quiet bit out loud. It's not always helpful, but that's what he does. But he does it for effect. And so I think bureaucracies like Australia, they're just struggling to keep up. They don't know how to move. And so when you hear Richard Marles or the Prime Minister or Penny Wong or anyone else from the government saying, we need Orcus and we need to keep this security pact with the US, because what about our trade routes? And I'm like, well, hang on a minute. Our biggest trading partner is China. So even that logic doesn't make sense. They're struggling to be able to put together a narrative that is logical, partly because what we're dealing with is somebody who is totally illogical.
You said in that answer that Trump has changed the rules of the game in the process of changing the world and the political reality. In the US, it often seemed to me, especially in the lead up to the last presidential election, that the Democrats were repeatedly bringing a spoon to a knife fight. They were talking about important things, but abstract things like democracy and defending institutions, things that are important to the function of a country but don't resonate with people's lives. And meanwhile, Trump was talking about immigrants poisoning the blood of the nation and eating people's pets. It's really ugly stuff, but a knife fight is ugly. Sarah, what do you think the politics of what has happened has taught us or could teach people about communication in progressive politics?
Well, I think one of the things that's happened since all that, because it was obviously the Democrats ran a terrible campaign. I think, and you can't. I don't know what Emma's view on this is, but Joe Biden did a disservice to the entire world. He actually did a lot of good things as president, but he needed to have gone much earlier, in my view. And not allowing a proper process for a selection of a new presidential candidate meant that all of Donald Trump's jibes about Kamala were landed because she wasn't seen as legitimate. And so there's a lot of other nastiness that comes in a knife fight, as you described, Noel, but right from the beginning it wasn't a fair fight. And but having said that, since then we've seen what's happened in Canada, and the Canadians standing up and saying no, we'll stare you down. They were rewarded. The government was rewarded by the Canadian community. And I would argue that here in Australia, that the same thing happened. And I must say, I know there's a lot of results still and fallout from the last election, but boy, I can't tell you how proud I am to be an Australian when we rejected that Trump-light policy and efforts that were being made by the Conservatives in the Liberal Party. I actually am really proud of us as a country that we stood up and said no to that. However, that was the community who did it. And what I need to see and what I want to see and what I think we do need to see is now the same type of courage from the government themselves. Because the people did it, the community did it. We said no, we don't want a bar of that culture war, Trump-style politics. Right down to the week before the election, Peter Dutton was still trying and his team was still trying to trot out those kind of Trump-style tropes like the attack on welcome to country, the attack on welfare recipients, the attack on immigrants and immigration, the attack on climate. So, they tried their hardest, but Australia is a different country, and we said no. But that's not going to be enough. We actually now need the Albanese government to show some courage as well, because you can't just leave it to the Australian people.
Yes, good point. So in just a moment, we will invite questions from the audience. We have a microphone on a stand here. So if you do have a question, please start making your way to the microphone. There's a huge amount to cover in this topic, so please come up to the stage and challenge. Whilst people are making their way to the microphone, Emma, I might just ask quickly, does it actually matter what Australia does? We're small, we're on the other side of the world. You see this argument sort of trotted out. It's often made in relation to climate change. Is Australia big enough and powerful enough for what we do and what we say to actually matter?
We do matter, Noah. We matter a lot. I think we are accustomed to hearing that it doesn't matter what Australia does, that we need to be, in our worst iteration, John Howard's version of the deputy sheriff to the United States. But in fact, Australia has a lot of power and a lot of agency in the world. Depending on the exchange rate of the day, Australia has the 12th-ish largest economy in the world. It's about the same size as Russia. We don't act like we have the 12th biggest economy in the world. When our governments go to meetings with the United States, be it Donald Trump or anybody else, we don't act like we have power in that relationship, even though we have considerable trade influence, for example, in the United States. And more broadly, I think Australia has a long and proud history of significant diplomatic success, of significant influence on genuine peace-building operations when we choose to invest in those skills. And it's not inevitable that we don't do that. There's no reason why Australia, which has a deep and long-standing interest in the maintenance and survival and thriving of the institutions of international law, can't stand up and say that the principles of international law apply to everyone. They apply to the United States, they apply to Israel, they apply to Iran. There's no reason that Australia can't play that role and actually act as a broker and use our relationship with the United States as leverage, which we have done in the past. Australia, for example, had a pretty tense time with the United States when the Hawke government opposed apartheid in South Africa. The relationship survived, and it was arguably at its best. It is at its best, I think, when we can be a true friend to the United States, the kind of friend that stands up and says, what you're doing is dangerous and wrong, and we're your friend and we're here to tell you. And we can do that. We can make brave political choices, but they are brave, and making those choices might go against the grain of the bureaucracy that Sarah was talking about and some of the political inclinations of the government of the day, but that is not inevitable, and I think recognising that we do have power and we do have influence and making the choice to use it is entirely possible.
Great, thank you. I see that one of our brave audience members has ventured all the way to the microphone. I would encourage others who have burning questions to please make their way as well. The rush, the stampede to the microphone, it's causing chaos. I hope everyone's okay back there with that broken glass. If we could get someone to help with that, that would be great. Yes, a question from the audience, please.
Hi, thank you very much to all of the panel for a very interesting and informative opening to this session. I want to ask, particularly Emma, but also Sarah, a question about what's going on in the thinking of the security thinking people, whoever they are, which, I don't know anything about them, about where they're headed now. Because it seems to me that they must know that China is not imperialist outside its own sphere, right? And that they don't do invasion. And they must know that America is not going to look after us because, or if they do, it will only be because it's in their interests. I'd like you to tell me that there are those in that strategy, security community who are totally onto this and are starting to figure out how to adjust Australia's position in response to the changing world. Please don't disillusion me.
Yes, a glimpse into the mindset of the security establishment, but make it upbeat.
That is a great question, and I will start by saying that I am not an insider, so I can't give you insight into the minds of people inside the Australian security establishment, which is, as I think, as Sarah said, really struggling with inertia, really struggling to get out of a way of thinking about the world and Australian security that is forever tied to the United States. But at the same time, it defies belief that people within the government, very smart people, don't realise, where Orcus is heading or where the United States is heading. I think they know. And I hope in my deepest heart that there is a plan B being drawn up for when Orcus inevitably falls over. But I don't have confirmation of that fact. I think your question, though, about China is a really important one and a really interesting one that we haven't yet got to. I think there are people in the security establishment, broadly speaking, within the government and within the armed forces that do see conflict with China as inevitable. I have been at security conferences where former heads of Australian intelligence agencies have said things like, we are literally engaged in hand-to-hand combat every day with Chinese spies and hackers. So this is the mindset, not just that all governments like that, including the United States, are engaged in spying and hacking, but this is literal hand-to-hand combat. I think that mindset is there, that conflict is inevitable. But I don't think that's necessarily the universal view. I think actually, to its credit, the Australian government has managed a very complex, often very difficult relationship with China actually quite well. Has recognised that, you cannot just separate security from trade, for example, when it comes to that relationship, and probably more importantly, that Australia's interests do not mirror the United States' interests when it comes to China. That we actually have a very different relationship and very different interest there. And so that for me is encouraging, that in the government, at least, there isn't that necessarily universal mindset about inevitable conflict. But that is continually undermined by the insistence that AUKUS is a thing that's going to happen, that no matter what, that even the foreign minister today met with Secretary of State Marco Rubio and talked about how the US understands the importance of AUKUS, and didn't get an ironclad guarantee, but everybody understands it's important and we're going to keep going with it. We're committed to this pathway. That keeps happening, and it might change. Things like that change very, very quickly. So I that's a long and roundabout way of saying that I do have hope that things will change, but I think that probably the government is going to have to be pressured into that position. It's not going to come, I don't think, from internal forces.
Do you want to add to that, Sarah?
Yeah, just briefly. I agree with Emma. I think there are obviously some people thinking about this, but until they get the leadership from government itself, it's very hard. And so that needs to come, and the government's not going to do it unless they feel like they're going to get rewarded from the community. Even then, we know on so many other issues they're slow to act. One of the things that I know the Australia Institute is coordinating and that we support is trying to get a parliamentary inquiry into Orcus. It's happening in the United Kingdom. There's obviously talk now with what's going on in the US, and I think we started off this conversation by saying we hadn't even had a public discussion about what any of this meant. And a parliamentary inquiry would be one way of shining the spotlight, but also then forcing, because those public servants, whether they're from Foreign Affairs or the Defence Department or the security apparatus, need to come and front those committees, and they'll have to have something to say. So all of those tools, I think we need to use to flush this out and to get people to think differently.
Thank you, Sarah. And that's a great opportunity to point out, on your seat when you arrived, there were a couple of postcards. One of them here is an invitation to sign the Australia Institute's petition calling for a parliamentary inquiry into Orcus. The Americans, we know, they're doing their review of it. The UK government, when they came in, they did a review. The only country that isn't having a serious examination or review is the one that's ponying up all of the dough and front-loading all of its commitments at the beginning. It's a ridiculous situation. So you'll see a QR code on the back of this postcard that was on your seat where you can sign the petition calling for a parliamentary inquiry. And I look forward to Sarah and her colleagues pushing for that when Parliament resumes not far from now. We have another question from the audience here.
Yes, thank you very much for your presentation. There have been words about insecurity a lot, and courage, courage of the Australian people to reject a proposition. I'm not trying to make this a furphy question, but Sarah, you've had the privilege of not holding executive power. My question is, what happens to politicians when they are in a party and get power? Because something seems to happen to them. I don't want to... you've met them, you've talked to them. Maybe you could give us a brief idea of what happens to them.
Thank you for that question. Yes, I've seen a few different responses to power and the lack of or use of power. Actually, as you were asking, I was reminded by the saying that, power corrupts. A good dear friend of mine says, no, power doesn't corrupt, it causes brain damage. And look, so for some people, I think, they really struggle with the ability to stand up and call things out or call it as they see it. The herd mentality of course, the two-party system we have in Australia. But that is starting to break down. I think you've got to remember that even with this election result, with the Labor Party winning a supermajority of seats, still only a third of the country voted for them. So 2/3 of the country voted for somebody other than Anthony Albanese or one of his candidates. And less than a third of people voted for the Liberal Party and Peter Dutton, and more than a third voted for the Greens and Independents and other minor parties. So that system is starting to break down. And I think what's going to be really interesting in this, we haven't even gone back to Parliament yet. We go back in 3 weeks. But when we go back, it would have the environment would have changed. I think the government will be feeling... if recent press conferences and interviews from the Prime Minister are anything to go by, a bit cocky. So it will change. They'll be feeling upbeat and good. But very quickly, it is going to start to sink in that the community actually expects the government to deliver. And you can't just keep going on as they are. It was very, very clear that the Australian population rejected what was being put on the table by the Liberal Party and Peter Dutton. They were scared of the environment that was being created from Donald Trump and the insecurity. The cost of living crisis did play a part, but it was supercharged. That anxiety was supercharged by the uncertainty. and including climate uncertainty and what that's doing to people's jobs and homes. And I just think about what's going on for the poor people on the New South Wales coast at the moment, just being bombarded again. And there is a lot going on and people are uncertain. And when you're feeling uncertain, when the community is feeling uncertain, incumbent governments usually get a tick. And they did get a tick. But still 2/3 of voters actually wanted something else. So that is going to be a tension going into this next parliament. And having more people on your backbench as a government means more people to manage, more questions to have to answer, more kind of needing to deal with the grumbles on the backbench, which the Labor Party have been were pretty disciplined at the last term, and I think you'll start to see people take a bit more liberty. Hopefully that means taking a bit more courage.
Thank you, Sarah. I see we have 2 more questions lined up here. If we go through them in rapid succession with rapid responses, I'm sure we can cover off on the 2. So please take it away.
Thank you a lot, Emma, Sarah and Noah, for this evening. I would like to know if you have some comments to make on some parallelism and similarities or differences between the reaction of the European Union to Trump's policies and Australia, because I'm reading both news and I think there are many similarities, even if you don't have the same sort of attachment to the US, not for the same reason. And how do you see how these similarities could help us to find another way, maybe with them?
Thank you. Thank you. So similarities and differences between Australia and EU response to Trump.
Thank you. I think that's a great question. I mean, I think the EU's response collectively has probably been overshadowed by NATO's response, particularly in the last couple of days, where you've had the NATO Secretary General literally call the President daddy, beating the Australian Prime Minister to it maybe. But I think the European Union's response has been quite interesting, driven, of course, by the French, and I think Macron has been probably one of the better managers of Trump. He understands that Trump is very susceptible to charm and displays of strength. You know, if you watch the way Macron even physically manages Trump, I think it's something that could be emulated. I think the European Union, more broadly's response to Trump, though, has been undermined, much like Australia's response to Trump, in its inability to, I think, stand up with a clear conscience for the international rule of law because of the EU's broad response to what Israel is doing to Palestine. And the same is true of Australia. You know, that Trump is not responsible for... he's entirely responsible for the catastrophic undermining of international law. He was able to do that because the Biden administration, supported by the European Union, supported by Australia, did much of that work for him. And I think, you know, the European Union leaders have to take some responsibility for that. But there's pressure from European communities, much as there is in Australia, I think, to respond more strongly to Trump. And again, much like in Australia, you can see things shifting a little bit. You know, even the fact that the European Union and Australia are talking about a security deal, which they have been in the last couple of weeks, is hugely significant. You know, even just 6 months ago, a trade deal with the European Union for Australia seemed impossible and seemed unthinkable. But talking about security with the European Union in that way, talking about managing complex relationships with China, is a mark of how much things are shifting, I think.
Thank you. At the risk of us running over time, I would like to invite our last question from the audience.
It's quick. My question is about our voting system. We have compulsory voting, and my feeling is that makes people... We're socialised into believing we have to vote, so who are we going to vote for? Even if they only think as they're walking into the polling booth, they're thinking they're going to the polling booth and then they're voting. So how much does that make a difference with the way we voted against a Trump system? And America, you just got to get people out to vote, not really what you're voting for, get them out. So how do you think that makes a difference here. That's my sort of feeling, that that's a difference.
I think it makes a huge difference. I really do. Both compulsory voting, but also our electoral system itself, the proportional representation in the Senate, the preferential system makes a huge difference. You know, trying to be a third party or get an independent elected in the United States, even if you could try and get out as much of the vote, is near impossible because they don't have the same preferential system. So, it's a huge, huge factor. And you could see that as somebody who spent 2.5 weeks on polling booths, you can see that in the way Australians think about why they're going to the polling booth. Some people take it as an attitude, well, I've just got to do it. I don't really like thinking about it. I hate all politicians, but, but they're still there. And ultimately they still choose, even if the vote is on the basis of the least worst option, which is often how a lot of people think. Heartbreaking to hear as a politician when somebody says that to you at the polling booth. Please don't say that. It's honest, and it's still a commitment and an understanding, as you say, about part of the responsibility of being an active Australian citizen. So, yeah, I've done a few US elections. I've been there a couple of times. It is totally different, and the focus. I was there for the 2012 Biden-Obama campaign, and all of the focus being on getting out the vote meant you weren't actually there to listen to people or to hear what was going on the other side. It's very tunnel vision. And I would say that the culture war tactics that were being run by the Dutton Liberal Party at this election, because they were importing this stuff and it's straight from the US, had forgotten that we have compulsory voting here. And Peter Dutton spent 2 nights on the week of the election on Sky News, hour after hour interview on Sky News. And I'm thinking, Sky After Dark. And I'm thinking, who are you talking to? Because you don't need to get these people out to vote. You actually need to get other people to vote for you. If the people watching Sky News aren't voting for you, then you're really going to do badly. And of course, then he did very badly. So I think there was a really... The idea that you could just transport the Trump campaign or bits of it into Australia has been proven to be wrong. So.
Oh, thank you. I'm sorry to say that brings us to the end of the event. We've run out of time, but could you please join me in a round of applause for Senator Sarah Hanson-Young and Dr. Emma Shortis. Thank you. So, because of time constraints, we were only really able to scratch the surface of the content in this compact but really rich and interesting essay from Emma. Like I say, copies are available to buy at the back of the venue. It is a cracking read, and Emma will also be available to sign copies of the book. I understand that Sarah got her copy signed just before we started, so she's jumped to the queue and got hers done, but you can get your copy signed back there as well. Also, I encourage you to please stay and enjoy a drink. We'll stay as long as we can and welcome conversation and questions, and would really enjoy just getting to know everybody who supports the Institute here in South Australia. So please stick with us as long as you can. Grab a drink, join us in conversation. Thank you again. My name was Noah Schultz-Bayard with the Australia Institute, and thanks Sarah and Emma. Thank you for coming along.
Thanks for watching. We love that we can make these videos free to watch, but they're not free to make. It's thanks to our generous supporters that we can keep making research and content that changes minds. So, if you like what we do, please consider giving to the Australia Institute so we can keep doing it. Visit our website australiainstitute.org.au and click the donate button to see how your support can help fund high quality research that matters.